Hi, everyone. Welcome to our program tonight. I'm not sure if we've gotten a whole lot of activity in the chat yet, but if you want, while we're waiting a few more minutes, just drop in the chat your name, where you're calling from, and then what is giving you joy right now. Let's see, I think we do have, yeah, some folks are talking. Great, wonderful. Please continue to roll in and we'll just get started in just a moment. Let's see. I love these. Hope for leadership, hope for our country. Oh, the colors of the trees. Yes, definitely. Kamala Harris. Yeah. Ariana Grande's new album. Amazing. Love it. Okay. Great. I'll have folks just keep putting things in the chat. Love to see it. I'll be continuing, and everyone should continue to scroll through and see all the wonderful things that are giving people joy. I will go ahead and get started. So hi, welcome to Carolina Jews for Justice and Temple Beth Orr's joint program, a united front against white nationalism, racism, and anti-Semitism, featuring Eric Ward, who I will introduce in just a moment. I am Rabbi Salem Pierce. I am the executive director of Carolina Jews for Justice. I'm really thrilled to be here with you tonight, honored to welcome Eric Ward into our communities, and really pleased to be co-hosting this program with Temple Beth Orr. And I first just want to acknowledge that Rabbi Lucy Dinner of Temple Beth Orr is not with us tonight, having had a heart attack a few weeks ago. We are really wishing she were here. We are missing her presence, her experience, and her wisdom. And I hope you all join me in wishing her a refuah shlema, a complete healing of body and spirit right now. So we are going to have a talk tonight about the white nationalist movement, its interlocking threats, and how we build solidarity across different experiences and diverse identities to fight for the safety and freedom that we all deserve. So just to, by way of introduction, I want to just talk for a moment about Carolina Jews for Justice, which is a grassroots network committed to creating a more just, fair, and compassionate North Carolina. We are a statewide Jewish justice organization, organizing a progressive voice in the Jewish community and a Jewish voice in the progressive community. And we build relationships where people help each other because we believe that individuals have a profound responsibility for the well-being of the whole. We're a multi-issue organization, and we work in an outward-facing way on economic, immigrant, racial justice, among other issues, and then in an inward way among our membership on community nourishment, leadership development, and political education. So tonight, after this introduction, Eric Ward will speak. We will have time for Q&A moderated by my colleague, Brandon Mond. As we go along, please feel free to drop questions in the chat. Brandon will collate them to ask during the Q&A at the end. So our speaker tonight, Eric Ward is a nationally recognized expert on the relationship between authoritarian movements, hate violence, and preserving inclusive democracy. And he is now the executive director of the Western States Center and a senior fellow with the Southern Poverty Law Center and Race Forward. And since Eric took the helm in 2017, Western States Center has become a national hub for innovative responses to white nationalism, anti-Semitism, and structural inequality towards a world, and I think this is really beautiful, where everyone can love, live, work, and worship free from bigotry and fear. So Eric has had a 30+ year civil rights with community groups, government, business leaders, human rights advocates, and philanthropy as an organizer director, program officer, consultant, and board member. He is currently co-chair for the Proteus Fund and a member of the Pop Culture Collaborative's Pluralist Visionaries Program, and the recipient of the Peabody Facebook Futures Media Award. Eric has extensive credentials as a speaker and a writer. He's been quoted in the New Yorker, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, many media outlets. And he is working on a forthcoming documentary about whiteness and race in America. And you may not know this, is an aspiring singer and songwriter under the name of Bulldog Shadow. So maybe that should be one of the questions someone asks in the Q&A, get Eric to sing a little bit. I just want to say that I'm honored to introduce Eric, who has had a profound influence on my work. I first heard Eric speak almost 4 years ago when he was on a panel at a gathering for rabbis and cantors in New York City, convened by Trua, my former employer, in February 2017, just after President Trump was inaugurated. And I was still a rabbinical student at the time, but I was looking ahead to a rabbinate in a Trump world, and I knew that I was woefully unprepared. Before the president was elected 4 years ago, I would have and did scoff at anyone who suggested that 21st century America was anything other than the safest time and place in all of history for Jews. I think that has changed a little bit. Eric's analysis of white nationalism and anti-Semitism has made me take seriously for the first time threats to my own safety and gave me a sharper understanding of what it means to both stand for my people while standing in solidarity with other groups targeted by white nationalists. And his article, Skin in the Game, came out a few months later, which I recommend that you all read. And during my 3 years at Trua, it came to really inform our approach to anti-Semitism and the analysis and political education that we shared with the rabbis and cantors that were part of Trua's network. So I'm very indebted to Eric and his work, and I'm honored to welcome him here to speak tonight. Thank you, Eric.
It's such a pleasure, and it's so wonderful to see you. I'm just remembering those workshops and how powerful those conversations were on anti-Semitism, and I think about how much has changed in that time. We may forget, but I believe some of those conversations happened almost in the shadow of the Unite the Right rally that took place in Charlottesville, I think about how much just has shifted, and we're going to get a chance to talk a little bit about that. I want to keep this fairly brief because I actually want to jump into questions, and the reason I want to do that is because there's a lot happening, there's a lot of dynamics, and I want to get to people's questions to see how we might reflect on them. Before we get there, I just want to say it's such a pleasure. Thank you everyone who is joining us in North Carolina and all points, northeast, west, south of there. I wish that I could be there in person with you all. I look forward to the time where we can break bread together. We're in a very significant moment. We are on the other side of elections that took place in this country that are probably some of the most significant elections to have ever taken place. It really was, in many ways, an election around the idea of whether the United States would embrace its aspirations of inclusion and of inclusive multiracial democracy, or whether it would backtrack into the space of exclusion and to reinforce itself. It's remarkable that once all the voting was done, that the majority of Americans actually chose inclusion, not by a huge margin, right? We don't want to read too much into it, but it is clear that the tide is turning in terms of the question of how the voting public understands America and its highest hopes for America. And it appears that that is grounded in the idea of a society that live loves, works, and worships free from fear and bigotry. It is a very serious moment because we should be clear about some other things. The first is, while Trump indeed was defeated on election day, it is not clear that Trumpism was. The ideas and the values that are grounded in conspiracy theories, that are grounded in the philosophy of might equals right, and in the idea of scapegoating, whether we were talking about the scapegoating of Jews, immigrants, Muslims, African Americans, the trans and non-binary community, the list goes on. So what does it mean for us moving forward? Well, before we talk about moving forward, I think it's important to take stock of where we are. We didn't arrive here over the last 4 years. What has been happening has been a long arc, an arc that I believe started in the late 40s and 50s with the arrival of what we understand to be the 1960 civil rights movement. Why do I point to the 1940s and 50s when talking about the 1960 civil rights movement, right? Who won most of its national gains in the later half of the 60s? It's because movements don't stop and start in the way that we imagine them to be. Mainly when we talk about things being in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s, what we are talking about are imaginary, right, or symbolic markers in time. And so too it was the civil rights movement, right? The civil rights movement, while it had its heyday in the 1960s, actually won most of its victories in the mid 1950s, whether we're talking about Rosa Parks or Little Rock, to name a few. Indeed, most of the early organizing and formation of the civil rights movement in the United States starts in the 1940s and 50s with the returning primarily of Black veterans into the South who had come home in the fight against fascism in Europe. That is what sets the stage, the contradiction of fighting for democracy, fighting for people's rights overseas, and then coming home and being denied those same rights at home. The civil rights movement was successful. And what I mean by successful is that the civil rights movement that was Black led, Black driven, built a coalition that was both moral enough and powerful enough to defeat white supremacy as the rule of law. And when I say the rule of law, what I mean is that we have to understand that previous to 1968, white supremacy was the uncontested terrain of America. It is how we understood the society, and it is how the society functioned. It dictated all facets of society. And beyond that dictation, it was the rule of law. It was how every debate, every conversation was decided within the United States. White supremacy was supreme. People didn't have to be taught to be white supremacists. It was generational, and folks were naturally socialized. It was in the air that we breathed. Along came the civil rights movement that overturned white supremacy. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying white supremacy no longer exists. What I'm saying is that white supremacy made a shift from de jure, the rule of law, to de facto, right? And this was a critically important stage, and it is the stage that we continue to find ourselves in. White supremacy, when I talk about it, I'm talking about a historical and present day system, right, of discrimination and exploitation that was founded on three pillars. The first was the genocide of Native people and the theft of resources. The second was chattel slavery, a unique, brutal system of slavery that was unlike any other system of slavery that had ever preceded it. It was so brutal that we fully don't understand the ramifications of that system, right? Over 100 years after it was ended as legal in the rule of law in the United States. It was a system that stripped people of their language, of their culture, right? Of their history and of their humanity. and chattel made them no more, right, valuable than any other form of property. It was a brutal system. But it wasn't just the theft of Native people and their lives. It wasn't just chattel slavery. The third part of this system was the control over sexuality, primarily the control over women. And this system is how society organized itself. It was based off the idea of white superiority, that the skin color dictated whether someone was seen as inferior or superior in the society. Black being inferior, whiteness being superior or the closest to God symbolically. It is why when we talk about white supremacy, we talk about anti-Blackness. White supremacy in this country was grounded within that anti-Blackness. And it is how it functioned until Black folks ended it. Now, it wasn't the first time that Black folks had challenged white supremacy. There were the revolts that ultimately led to the Civil War. And Black folks, while leading this and while being centered around their liberation, worked with other allies who understood that the way that we all got free was by advancing Black liberation. So the civil rights movement comes along, it defeats de facto, or sorry, de jure white supremacy. And imagine you believe in Jim Crow. Imagine you believe in this idea called separate but equal. You believe Black people are inferior in every way. How do you suddenly explain that you lost to Black political power in the United States? Do you all of a sudden stop and say, well, I guess Black folks aren't inferior after all? I must have been wrong. Not if you believe that Black people were inferior, not if that is your worldview. In fact, it will be the last thing you would believe. So those who believed in segregation and Jim Crow had to figure out why they lost. How did they lose to this thing called multiracial democracy that was growing in America, that had been fought for and paid for largely by Black lives, and was expanding to shift how this country managed itself, how it governed itself? And so it began to look around, and it borrowed from things like the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, a fake document that was created in Europe by secret Russian czarist, by secret police in czarist Russia, in order to attack democracy that was spreading in Western Europe. That book was picked up by an industrialist here in the United States by the name of Henry Ford, who republished it under a series of essays called The International Jew, which he then distributed in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, around the country in his auto dealerships, exposing tens of thousands of Americans to this fake anti-Semitic idea. The idea of the protocols was simply this: that Jews were not merely just a religious other, that they were wholly a racialized other, a nefarious, almost demonic race that sought to take control of systems of economy, culture, and politics in order to destroy white Christendom. You see, the things we hear now, language like okay to be white or white genocide, are actually cultivated from the pages of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. If white supremacy, as I talked about earlier, is grounded in anti-Blackness and in the paper of race, well, this movement that was responding into reaction to the loss to the civil rights movement was grounded in something else. For them, they clinged on to this anti-Semitic conspiracy because it answered their question. It allowed them to say, this is why we lost, without having to give up the idea that Black people were inferior. It's often why I argue that anti-Semitism isn't merely a threat to the Jewish community, it is a threat to non-Jews, particularly people of color, Blacks, Latinos, and other communities. Why is it a threat? Because anti-Semitism became the answer for a hardcore in this society that seeks to build a backlash against the gains of the 1960 civil rights movement. Let me explain. There is a movement called white nationalism, and I'm going to distinguish it from that system of white supremacy. When I'm talking about white nationalism, I mean a social movement. A social movement, much like the 1960 civil rights movement is a social movement, or the climate justice movement is a social movement, or the LGBTQ community has built their own social movements, or the immigrant rights movement. It is a movement that is made up of leaders, of theories, of think tanks, of grassroots organizations. Often when we think of the white nationalist movement, we rely on our own stereotypes, the idea of someone driving around in a pickup truck with a shotgun rack in the back, right? Drinking a Budweiser, right? Hasn't graduated from high school, right? Lives in a rural community. But that's simply not true. The white nationalist movement, according to a study that was done in the 1990s by a sociologist by the name of James Aho, shows that the white nationalist movement in Idaho was better educated than the general population as a whole. It also had a higher level of income than the general population as a whole. For us, we reduce bigotry to an economic equation, and that is a myth. Economics do not drive bigotry in our country. Values and questions of governance drive largely bigotry in our society. It is about who has a say in the blueprint of the aspiration of American democracy. For white nationalists, they saw the loss of the civil rights movement as a significant blow to control and exploitation. However, they admitted defeat. Many white nationalist theorists said that we lost the fight to the civil rights movement. And instead, they began to build a new theory. And while white supremacy was grounded in race, as I said before, this new theory was grounded in anti-Semitism. It was no longer a war around keeping people of color in their place. It became a war, an existential war against the Jewish community, where people of color were not seen as having agency, but merely being puppets on the strings of their Jewish masters. That is the danger of anti-Semitism in this moment. But anti-Semitism isn't just a danger in theory. It has manifested itself in many real ways over the last 4 years. From murders, and not just murders from those on the far right and white nationalists, so that's where most of them have originated from, but it has mainstreamed anti-Semitism in society today. Over the last week, as folks are waiting for the election results, Western State Center continues to monitor anti-Semitic events. Whether that is Newt Gingrich's comments last Sunday on a Sunday news show, where he talked about how the elections were stolen by folks, by George Soros and those people like him. I will let you unpack that code word. Whether we are talking about the split in the unarmed paramilitary group called the Proud Boys, who have wreaked havoc on the streets of America with their violence, who recently announced that they are arguing over a split, and half of them want to be explicitly white nationalists. One of them recently just blamed Jews, right? When Netanyahu recognized the president-elect Joe Biden, one of the leaders of that movement posted onto social media that it was a betrayal by all Jews. We should be clear that anti-Semitism continues to weave a thread through this historic moment. And when we don't recognize it, we leave ourselves weaker. We should be clear that anti-Semitism seeks to undercut democratic practice by building conspiracy theories that undercut the belief that people matter and that their choices and agency matter. You see, at the end of the day, we have to recognize that anti-Semitism has likely murdered more non-Jews from hate violence than the Jewish community itself. Yes, we are familiar with the targeting of Jews at the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh. We understand how that was driven by anti-Jewish hate and by the ideology of anti-Semitism. But let's be clear, so were the killings of Latinos that occurred in El Paso, Texas. It wasn't just anti-Latino or anti-immigrant bias. The killer was driven by the belief that he was in an existential war with Jews. And he was not alone. The individual who targeted African Americans worshiping in Charleston, South Carolina, was also driven by this belief that he was in an existential war with the Jewish community. And so was the killer in Madison, Wisconsin, who targeted the Sikh community, believing that they were Muslims. In fact, when we look at most of the mission-oriented hate crimes that occur in the United States, they're mostly driven by this belief, this anti-Semitic belief. That is why anti-Semitism is a threat to all of us. It denies the agency of vulnerable communities fighting against racism and other forms of bigotry. It is used to dismantle democracy. And what little democracy that has been built in this country has been built by the sweat and the sacrifice of Black people over generations. The third is that anti-Semitism leads to violence, and not just against the Jewish community. We no longer have to wonder if anti-Semitism is a threat in America. Much data proves to us that it is. But for many of us on the left and liberals, we get confused around anti-Semitism. We get confused because it doesn't look like anti-Black racism. It doesn't look like anti-Latino racism. It doesn't look like racism that Muslims face as Islamophobia becomes increasingly racialized. And because it doesn't look like it, because it targets a community that is largely white-skinned, right, or Ashkenazi, our immediate response is it must not be a critical issue because it doesn't look like all forms of bigotry. But I want to tell you something. No form of bigotry looks like another form of bigotry. Each form of bigotry in our society plays a specific role, and so too does anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism seeks to put Jews as a buffer between the haves and the have-nots in this society, so that those who are struggling for equality are distracted by focusing and scapegoating a small majority. If anti-Semitism exists within vulnerable communities such as the African American community and others, it is because anti-Semitism is doing exactly what it was designed to do, to be a buffer, to confuse folks in their struggle for justice in the society, and to distract them by providing another scapegoat, an acceptable scapegoat in the society. Anti-Semitism is a threat to Black progress. And the Jewish community's refusal for many years to center anti-Semitism left us all vulnerable. It left us vulnerable because it left the discussion of anti-Semitism to a very small segment in the Jewish community, who primarily used anti-Semitism as a partisan wedge. It is time for us to pick up the game. We live in a moment where democracy is under threat in our country. Democracy matters. Democracy is the Black program in America. It was built off of Black labor. And what little democracy exists is due to Black struggle. Unlike white nationalism, unlike white supremacy, the Black program, as it is strengthened and advanced, provides abundance to all communities. For you see, while white supremacy and white nationalism are grounded in scarcity, Black liberation is grounded in abundance. It's not simply about Black folks getting free. It is about freeing our society so that we can engage the opportunities that are before us, opportunities that allow us to address the fact there are currently 51 million Americans out of work currently, disproportionately Black women, so that we can tackle the fact that 250,000 Americans and growing, right, have or will die from COVID before the end of the year. by understanding that within those numbers currently, 1 out of every 875 Black people has died in the last 8 months from COVID. And that bears repeating because numbers are hard to hold, but I'm going to say it again. 1 out of every 875 Black people has now died from COVID-19 in the last 8 months. We are in a very serious moment. We are watching the political violence around us. We watch the critical constitutional crisis that is forming around us, and it is time for us to get serious. Truth one in my closing is this. Stop worrying about if anti-Semitism looks like other forms of bigotry, because the day that it looks like anti-Black racism, we will be too late. We need to take anti-Semitism seriously. That means leaning in. That means getting comfortable with the conversation. It means understanding the nuances. The second is we need to stop apologizing for democracy. Democracy is the most radical concept to ever be invented. The idea that people have both the skills and the right to govern their own affairs, right, is one of the most radical concepts. Now, folks like to poo-poo it across the political spectrum. But when you do that, what you are doing is undercutting Black struggle. Again, if democracy exists in America and what little of it exists is due to Black struggle. The third is this. Stop treating anti-Semitism as merely a set of behaviors. It's not about things people say. It is about an ideology. It is an ideology that is inherently anti-democratic, small d. And when we are unaware of how anti-Semitism functions, when we don't push non-Jewish communities to understand how it functions, it leaves all of us vulnerable. As I watched QAnon take off and begin to influence folks around the country, I watched how our own movements and leaders were flat-footed in responding to the phenomena. Very few understood that QAnon directly paralleled all of the major points of the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. No one knew to call it and name it as anti-Semitic when it came out the gate. So it grew in oxygen and it festered in the shadows until it landed on our doorstep. Landed on our doorstep in a way that has created one of the largest disinformation cults to ever exist in modern day America. By taking anti-Semitism seriously, we defend the gains before us and we set the stage for the gains that come after. This is about being disciplined in this moment. This isn't about creating hierarchies of oppression. It is about understanding all the challenges that are on the table. And it is about understanding that we are not making a choice, and we don't have a choice, between taking on white supremacy and taking on white nationalism in order to preserve democracy. It's understanding that we have to take on both. One is grounded on a history of racism. The other is written on anti-Semitism. We move forward together. We build alliances by stepping out of our silos and holding our contradictions and leaning in with curiosity. I want to be clear with folks. You don't get Black liberation without addressing anti-Semitism. And the longer you wait to take on anti-Semitism, the harder it is for me to get free. And I really want to be free. And I want this society to be free too. And I think you do too. So let's do our work.
Thank you so much, Eric. Can we get some maybe silent clapping, clapping in ASL with our fingers? Eric, if you want, you can scroll across and see
People
the
are amazing.
applause. Hey y'all, my name is Brandon. I use to pronounce he, him, and I live in Durham. I'm an organizer with Carolina Jews for Justice, and I'm going to be moderating a Q&A session with Eric. So if you have questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat, and I'll collate some of them and try to get to as many of them as possible. And I also just, while people are writing their questions, want to plug again the article that Eric wrote for Political Research Associates, Skin in the Game. If someone could drop that in the chat. I remember in the summer of 2017, I was living in Austin and I was organizing with Jews there. And my friend Noah sent me an email that was just like, the subject line was like, "This thing is really important." And it was a link to Eric's article. And like all good, slightly longish articles, it sat as a tab on my browser for a couple weeks. And you know, it's gotta age like fine wine. But when I finally took the time to read it, it really also informed a lot of my work organizing Jews around their stake and our stake in the fight for liberation. So as people are thinking about questions, I'm just going to start us off. The first is at the beginning of this, your talk, Eric, you spoke about how the tide is actually turning, and that's one of the things that we gleaned from this election. And I know for many of us who maybe have been in a defensive posture in the last 4 years, and also maybe in the last 4 years have just really started to become clear about our stake via anti-Semitism in this work. And so we've been in this defensive posture, both like physically with our bodies and also in the way that we're organizing and being with our community. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about with this turning tide, how should our posture be turning in terms of the way we're organizing and positioning with our community?
Yeah. So Brandon, great question, and I'm glad you let that essay sit there and age too. And I feel like I should pay you for having to read that many words. But thank you for doing so. Look, we should be clear, right? The white nationalist movement is a backlash. Now, it may be a revolutionary backlash in the sense that it realizes there is no going backward, right? So it's a backlash that is looking forward. Its response, right, is not to try to recreate white supremacy. Its goal, right, is to remove folks of color and Jews from the United States, right, from the geography of the United States altogether, right? Its program is ethnic cleansing, and we should just be clear about that, and we should name that, right? Despite all the "Make America Great Again" like rhetoric, right? Its goal is to continue the criminalization, right, terrorization, right, and the destruction of democratic practice, because that is the inoculation against authoritarianism. Now, they are running around. I want to speak right now to this moment right now. You know, we have Mr. Trump, who has, you know, yet to concede the elections. We have a significant portion of Republican leadership who's failed to concede the election, right? The attempt is to try to get us all wounded up. You know, he reminds me kind of I wrote yesterday to someone, you know, Mr. Trump reminds me of the alt-right version of Johnny Rotten, right? You ever get the feeling you've been swindled, right? And what I mean by that is, you know, let's be clear, right? Donald Trump hasn't conceded the election primarily because he is stealing money out of the back pockets of his supporters right now. He is building dollars off the idea of crisis. And that has been 4 years of Trumpism. Now, we could worry and fret, does Donald Trump mean what he says? I think he means what he says, but I don't think we should pay it any mind until he actually does something. And it's distracting of our energy. It's distracting of our attention. Where we need to be turning our energy right now is making sure our base, right, is getting some rest. And for those who can't, that they are fired up. We should be spending time continuing to build our plans. What do we do if there is a move towards a full-fledged kind of authoritarian power grab? That's what we should be focused on, not on what Donald Trump, says and blah, 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 blah. I mean, what I told folks earlier on a conference is, look, people huff all the time. We should not worry about Donald Trump and his ilk until they decide to puff. And when they puff, hopefully we will have done the work of making sure our communities are ready across the United States to defend democracy. Next, we should spend our time thinking about what comes next. Yes, we may have defeated Trump. I'm not sure if we defeated Trumpism, right? There has been 4 years of unbridled attack on democracy. It's so bad that even the GOP is now complaining about it, right? We've been hearing them for days talk, complain about the election system that they primarily have created, right? Through the suppression of the Voting Rights Act, right? Through the suppression of voters, right? Through 2 decades, right, of intentional undercutting of the electoral system in this country. It's so bad that even now they're complaining about it. And we could sit here and we could have that debate with them about how messed up the electoral system is. I don't want to have that debate. I think it's messed up, right? I think it's a sad state of affairs that the United States of America has one of the worst electoral systems of any democracy, right now on the planet. That is just super embarrassing. It's super embarrassing that it's a week after the elections and we are relying on hand counts to try to understand what the results are in some states. That's ridiculous. Let us turn our attention a little bit, right, to actually repairing and strengthening some of the democracy that's been built. Let's make sure we have free and accessible elections in 4 years. Let's make sure we turn our energy into redistricting. Let us make sure we understand how we're going to come to terms, right, with a half-empty census that is underway in this country. We actually have some real things to contend with, or we could find ourselves back here in 4 years. Now I'm going to say something, Brandon. None of those 3 things sound very exciting to folks, right? It's like, well, that doesn't seem very exciting. That seems very bureaucratic. Well, you know what? Not everything about social change is exciting and exhilarating. Some of it is about hard work. And this is a moment that calls for hard work. Now, we may think, right? We're tired, we're exhausted. I get it. We've been pulled in lots of different ways. It's unfair that it's my burden that I even have to do this. That's all right. I get that is all correct and right. But we have an obligation, right? And the obligation isn't just about us. We are the Baird Rustin generation. It is unlikely that our generation will reap, right, the benefits of our work. What it means is that we have an obligation to those who came before us, right? Those who struggled under much harsher conditions in this society. And we have an obligation for those who come after us. So we have to show up in this moment. And we show up by plugging the holes in the boat of democracy, right? The democracy that we actually built. And so we have to stop. And, I've been telling Black folks this all this week. We have to be cautious about other people's programs, right? Other people's programs, they don't take democracy seriously because they didn't have to build it. Most of them didn't die to get it here, right? They don't understand how much work it took to get us to this moment. We have to focus on the Black program. And the Black program is about building a real democracy in America. It is about a rainbow nation that understands anti-Blackness, that knows how to center
right, Black leadership in this moment, right, and moving forward, and understands that their liberation, right, is inseparable from Black liberation. It doesn't matter whether you're Jewish, Muslim, immigrant, white, Asian, Native American. It is time for us to make democracy real. And the way we make it real is by backing Black leadership, which has primarily been Black women's leadership in this moment.
Thank you so much for that answer, Eric. I have a couple more heavy hitters for you. So the first is from Adrian, who's wondering if you could unpack the point that anti-Semitism undercuts the idea of personal agency and choice, juxtaposed with rugged individualism, both seeking to dismantle democracy and democratic institutions.
Yeah. So the way that anti-Semitism functions, anti-Semitism is fascinating in the ways that it functions. But one of the ways that it functions is as a form of anti-modernism, right? Or anti-liberalism. And I mean liberalism in the broad sense, the idea of inclusive, transparent, and accountable government that understands the importance of rights and dignity in a society, the understanding of equality under the law. Again, the things that Black struggle has brought about in this country. Where anti-Semitism comes into play is anti-Semitism raises doubts about all those things, right? What it does is it takes a very small grouping of people in American society, right? The Jewish community, I don't know what the percentage of the Jewish community is in the United States. I'm guessing, I've seen things that say 3%. I'll stick with that. I suspect it's a little bit smaller for other reasons we can get into later. But here we have a small community, and everything that the society struggles with, right? Movements struggle with, get placed as a burden, right? A burden on the Jewish community, right? Jews are seen as nefarious, right? Deceitful, right? Conspiratorial. And so everything that society struggles with gets placed as some kind of nefarious deed by this Jewish conspiracy, right? And we see it when we are having conversations about economic inequality. We see it when we're having conversations around political inequality, but we don't recognize it because we don't recognize anti-Semitism. So for instance, we understand really clearly what people mean when they start using the term thug when they're talking about Black folks, right? Or when they're talking about welfare pimps. We know what this means. When we hear about urban crime, right? We know exactly what these code words mean in terms of anti-Black racism. But when folks use the term globalist, when folks start talking about the political establishment, when folks start talking about Hollywood, when folks start talking about the liberal establishment, we act as if these aren't anti-Semitic tropes that have been in use, right, for nearly 100 years in the United States. We act as if they have no value or no impact. So when Donald Trump gets up and talks about the globalist who is helping Muslims and refugees invade America, and his name is George Soros, we sit back as if they're actually just talking about George Soros, right, rather than the entire Jewish community. How anti-Semitism works is that it provides a set of code words that leads people to believe that society runs in a conspiratorial fashion rather than around the organization of power, right? And how power aligns around values. It becomes a distraction. It is a way to distract people from engaging in struggle. And let's remember again, the purpose of anti-Semitism in American society, right, is not to move the elites. It is to move and reconfigure the most vulnerable in our society: poor whites, Black people, immigrants, refugees. It is to play off of their fears and stereotypes from socialized anti-Semitism so that they are more focused on conspiratorial power, which doesn't really exist, right? Instead of organizing to contest power for equality. And it works very well.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for unpacking that and clarifying that. The next question that we have is from Carol, and it's another heavy-hitting question. So Carol writes, "Thanks for being with us. I'm wondering if you could talk about how right-wing governments that have activated white nationalists are also adopting definitions of anti-Semitism that encompass any criticism of the state of Israel. How can progressive organizers fight bad faith accusations of anti-Semitism from the right, while also communicating clearly that anti-Semitism is dangerous to our communities?"
Yeah. Look, I think we have to get better on anti-Semitism, right? You know, I'm a believer. I'm just a longtime organizer, and so I'm a Black organizer, and I'm Black in America. So the idea that you get to do anything with no reaction is just not a world that I live in, right? I live in a world of a society that has spent most of its existence, right, trying to keep Black people within a frame of social control, right? And so I approach these questions in a very different way. I would say that this is something we should wrestle with. You can't be wedged around an issue that you can't get wedged on, right? So if authoritarians are wedging our movements off of anti-Semitism, right, our response should not be that there's no anti-Semitism in our movements. I've been an organizer for a long time. I don't organize people around things that don't exist. It's not a good organizing strategy. So if the right is doing a good job at wedging us around anti-Semitism, it means we have work to do in our own communities. And we can't do that work if we try to deny that anti-Semitism exists. Now, here's a way that we should be approaching that anti-Semitism. We should stop approaching it as if somehow it's a big surprise that anti-Semitism exists. We don't do that around other forms of bigotry, right? If someone says racism exists in our social movement, we all say, yes, racism exists in our social movement. If someone says transphobia exists in our social movement, we say transphobia exists in our social movements. It's quite natural. It doesn't make us bad people. It makes us part of the society that we are in, right? If bigotry exists in a society, it means it's in the air that we breathe, right? And left unconscious, right? If it stays as an unconscious form of bigotry, it means we're more vulnerable to it. And as we all know, right, those of us who do work around racial bias and diversity, DEI initiatives, diversity, equality, inclusion, right? One of the things we know as anti-bias trainers is that bias is most likely to express itself when people feel under stress, right? And this is a society under stress right now. Folks who are working on issues around peace in the Middle East or negotiations, right, or human rights, right, that is working under stress. So it is more likely under stress, our biases are likely to appear. So denying them, right, I think we should never start in that way. Why would we concede that? Why not instead say, yes, right? These forms of bigotry exist in all of our societies. The difference is, if I could say the difference is those movements, unlike white nationalists, are actually trying to engage around this conversation. And we may not all see it in the same way. We may not all come to the same conclusion, right? We may be debating, we may be arguing about it, right? But at least we are arguing and debating about it. At least we are fighting over what does anti-Semitism mean? And you point to one other you point to another sector in society where that is happening, right? It ain't happening in any other sector in society. So that, first of all, says something is good is happening in our movements. In terms of the wedges, the stronger we get in those conversations, the more inoculated we are from these wedges. And the more we engage in this conversation, the stronger our unified responses are when these wedges happen. I see it more and more every day when our communities, when folks try to wedge our communities by using anti-Semitism as a partisanship. The last thing, Brand, because this is a long answer to what you hope was a quick, you asked a quick question. I think you were hoping for a quick answer. But I will say this. The third thing that we have to do, right, is we to ourselves have to restrain from using anti-Semitism, right, attacking anti-Semitism in a partisan manner. It is true, right? It is absolutely true. Anti-Semitism on the right is a much more significant threat in this country. And I'm happy to run the numbers against anyone who does not believe that, right? What I will say, though, is this. We have to stop worrying about left and right anti-Semitism. You don't hear me talk about Black anti-Semitism because you never hear me talk about white anti-Semitism. What you're going to hear me say is that anti-Semitism exists in America. And the only question is who is organizing it? How close are they to power? And what is their purpose? Is it intentional, right? Or is it a misstep? And those help us guide how we respond inside of our movements, right? We have to stop treating everyone who does something anti-Semitic as if they're David Duke, right? Imagine if I treated everyone who said something anti-Black like they were David Duke, right? I wouldn't probably be on any call, any presentation. I wouldn't be engaging with everyone. So we need to rein it back a little bit. We need to understand that we are movements that have not been discussing anti-Semitism very long. It's only, folks may want to reset history, but I'll be very clear. 4 years ago, most of the folks I talked to today weren't talking about anti-Semitism. And if they were talking about it, even in the Jewish community, you were mainly rolling your eyes at me. You were mainly saying, this ain't nothing. Why is he talking about this? This isn't important. So I'm glad everyone is talking about it now, but don't act like you were born woke here, right? I'm not acting like I was born woke. We are all struggling to have this conversation. And I believe mostly because the majority of us believe, whether we are Jewish or non-Jewish, that it's an important conversation to have. And it preserves us from being attacked by wedges.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Eric. And I think that was just the right length of answer. Yeah, I want to be really respectful of your time. Thank you so much for coming and talking and answering our questions. And I just want to reflect, like, one thing that you said at that very last answer you gave, that I'm going to be taking away from this, which is when evaluating the threat of anti-Semitism, we have to think about who's organizing the anti-Semitism, what is their proximity to power, and what is their intention? Was it intentional or was it a misstep? And yeah, I'm just like really, really, really chewing on that. And I want to thank everyone who came tonight for engaging in this conversation, because like Eric said, it's actually just like having this conversation and like discussing this and hearing opinions that might not be exactly aligned with yours or arguments that you may have never heard of. That's going to make us stronger as a movement, as a progressive movement in North Carolina, and help us play a role in, one, combating the real anti-Semitism that exists in North Carolina vis-a-vis the very real organized white nationalist movement here, and also help our movement for justice remain clear on anti-Semitism, educate our partners, as well as not allow false accusations of anti-Semitism to wedge us. And to end, there's no way I could end with my own words after just hearing Eric talk. And so I just want to read a quote from Skin in the Game, the essay by Eric that's been referenced several times, which is at the very end of the essay, Eric writes, "As much as I draw inspiration from the Jewish community, and as much as I adore my Jewish partner and friends, it was my organizing against anti-Semitism as a Black anti-racist that first pulled me to the Jewish community, not the other way around. I developed an analysis of anti-Semitism because I wanted to smash white supremacy, because I wanted to be free." And one thing that Eric so beautifully laid out is how interlocking the system of oppression of anti-Semitism is with all of these other systems of oppression, specifically white supremacy, specifically anti-Black racism, and racial capitalism. And so what my question to leave us with, especially I see a lot of white Jewish people on the call, but I think that, you know, for our multiracial Jewish community, this is also an applicable question. When we think about fighting against white supremacy or against capitalism or against any of these systems of oppression, like we have to approach this as Jews and we want the end of anti-Semitism. And just as Eric is talking about fighting anti-Semitism so he can be free, how are you going to fight anti-Black racism so you can be free? How are you going to fight wealth inequality so that you can be free? And I think that this is the question that we should all be reflecting on as we take some much needed rest, as Eric says, over the next couple months, and come back really strong in January, because we have a lot of work to do. So with that, I'm going to say thank you to Eric, thank you to Rabbi Salem, thank you to Temple Beth Orr, and to Rabbi Lucy Dinner, and to Sherry Thorstad and Hillary Lamb. We have a lot of work to do, y'all, but it's so great to see everyone's faces. And watch out for a follow-up email and for more emails from Carolina Jews for Justice for ways that you can plug in to the fight for justice here in North Carolina.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.